This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian, and if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that I'm always encouraging all of you to email me or contact me on social media with your feedback and story ideas. And after my recent episode where I featured a couple of my African American friends describing their experiences traveling the world, I heard from Norma in Colorado, who said, you should speak to my friend Parker, who's working on this crowdsourced project to help people of color and members of other marginalized communities exchange information on the places they visit so they could feel safe when they're traveling. So I decided to follow up to find out more. Parker McMullen Bushman joins me, along with her collaborator, Crystal Egley. Welcome to both of you. And Parker, you're taking inspiration from the Negro Traveler's Green Book, which was sort of like a AAA guide for African Americans taking road trips between the 1930s and the 1960s. For listeners who haven't heard of the Green Book or didn't see that film that came out a few years ago, why don't you start off by describing what it was?
Yeah, so the Green Book was created by a gentleman named Victor Green, and during that time, folks were not able to easily discern where safe spaces were. And this guide was actually used more for people who were traveling in northern states and out west, because in the South, things were a little more clearly marked. But if you were traveling cross country, you may not know if you were going through a sundown town or where a safe hotel would be to stay and visit, where they would accept you. And so he accepted letters from folks all over the country that would list the safe spaces that they had been and that they knew of, and then each year produced this guide that people could purchase and use. And when he originally created it, he was hoping that there would be a day that this guide would no longer be needed. And in the 60s with the civil rights movement, and we were seeing, laws change and things change, they thought that that was the time to stop printing it. But Crystal and I can attest that there are still experiences that happen today with people of color and other people of marginalized identities. Crystal had the amazing idea that she brought to me. She was like, what if we revived the original Green Book in a new digital form? And I was like, that's amazing. And I'm totally in.
As you mentioned, the original Green Book stopped being printed in the late 1960s after the Civil Rights Act was passed and conditions for African Americans seemed to be improving. Now it's half a century later, and while things still aren't perfect, we've obviously come a long way since then. So I'm wondering, was there a particular experience you had or a situation you encountered that made you go back and say, you know what, it might actually be helpful if we still had a Green Book?
Yeah, this is Crystal. So for me, I grew accustomed to the discomfort I felt while traveling around the country, like on road trips, camping trips. I'm really outdoorsy. But it wasn't until I took up hunting a few years ago where I added a firearm into that element, and all of a sudden things changed. So now I'm out there not only worried about just walking in with the color of my skin, but walking in with the color of my skin and a firearm to like public lands, trails. Common practice for hunters is to knock on doors to ask permission to hunt on land. No way am I going to do that in unknown locations, right? It's very common practice for my white peers to do so, but it can be deadly to someone of my identity. And a lot of people weren't really understanding that when I tried to explain it. Without living this, it's hard to explain. It's not necessarily that a place is bad. It's the unknown of whether or not it could be. And I have to err on the side of caution. I have to, So I was like, what if I had a network of places where I knew I could go and be safe, right? What if I had gas stations in rural areas that I just knew I could trust? Maybe on my way, they were all going to be great, but I just don't know. So I was thinking about that and I was like, wait, somebody's already done this. And that was Victor Green. And we were just talking about how to modernize it. And we don't want it to be just cancel culture and call out places and say, that place is bad. We want to aggregate the data. Like, so if it's just me, maybe it was the color of my skin, maybe not. But if 80 people in 1 week with my identity feel uncomfortable, that's a different story. So we want to collect the data of these stories and these experiences to basically prove we're not making this stuff up. This is real. These experiences are real. And we also want to provide resources for businesses to realize it. Some of them may not even realize that we are feeling this way, because I'm certainly not going to go and tell them right then. So we want to make sure they realize it, and then they have the resources available right there on the same website so that they can do better. Now that they know better, they can do better. And we want to build up our economy around places that we feel safe and welcome, not necessarily just say, hey, that bakery stinks because they wouldn't make a cake for my friends. But we're like, hey, did you know that there's a business incentive as well as a general obligation to these communities, obviously. But there's also a business sense behind this. Look how many customers you could have had. Here are some tools in order to embrace these demographics and make them feel more welcome in your space.
What about you, Parker? Was there a particular motivation for you?
You know, I think we want to believe that those times are past, right? With the civil rights movement, it really seemed like we were making progress as a culture. But I think a lot of things kind of went underground. And so I don't think that there was a time that this was not important to me, though this has given it a vehicle. You know, even as a kid, my family, we would talk about where are the safe places to go, where do you not find yourself after dark, what places of town were accepting and what were not. And right now that information is pretty much by word of mouth in communities, but I think now we've had a lot of incidences, and with the advent of social media and bringing these things into the news, like people can see that it hasn't gone away. Like now I've got a Google alert for stories like this. And, you know, just in the last week, we had a mother who was at the pool with her children at a hotel that they were staying at, got the police called on them because the hotel person didn't believe that they were actually staying at the hotel. We had another gentleman who's a historian, was on the beach at Tybee doing a social media video, and someone called the police on him and said that he was cursing into his phone, which seems like an interesting reason even to call the police. But luckily, when the police got there, he had been taking a video and had a whole video to prove that he wasn't being inappropriate in public. And so at a time when people of color can have the police called on them just for existing in public spaces, having the need to list out what businesses are inclusive, I think is important. And to what Crystal said, the data is really important. So I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting for organizations for lots of years. And I'm frequently asked, what is the business case for inclusion? You know, organizations want to be able to say, yeah, it's the right thing to do, but also like everyone lives and dies by data. And so being able to provide data, I think is important. And when you look at a site like TripAdvisor or Yelp, they are providing data for organizations on their customer service. They're providing information for the public on other people's experiences. And yeah, some of it's concrete, like whether or not your hotel has a pool, but a lot of it is subjective, like the customer service was good, the soup was too hot, the soup was too cold, you know? And so with a website like this, we want to do for inclusion what Yelp has done for customer service, and for people to be able to list their experiences and answer the question, did I feel welcome? Did I feel safe? Did I feel celebrated in this space? And then people can look, and businesses finally have data. They can look and say, oh, we're doing really well, or, oh, our inclusivity score is down. And it looks like the majority of people who are saying they don't feel safe or welcome are women. And they are listing these certain things as reasons why they didn't feel this way. Now there's suddenly data and a course of action that we can take to make our place more inclusive.
I think a lot of white people might have this perception that racism and discrimination are primarily a problem in places like the southern part of the United States. So, for example, Colorado, where both of you are, isn't a region that people would necessarily think would be problematic for Black travelers. But if listeners heard my recent episode about traveling while Black, my friend Nate told that story of the time he attended a friend's wedding near the small town of Georgetown, Colorado. He and the one other Black person were followed by a white guy in a pickup truck as they were returning to their hotel from dinner one evening. And after this guy asked them in this sort of menacing tone if they were lost, they knew immediately that they had to get out of there because they didn't feel safe. For people who haven't experienced this sort of thing themselves, I guess your message is that these sorts of experiences are actually much more commonplace and widespread than some folks might realize?
Yes. So for me, I was actually just planning a hunt this morning in Colorado with a friend of mine who is a Black male. And I was actually looking at a map, not to figure out where all of the elk were, but I was looking at a map to figure out where we could experience potential racism combined with elk herd migration patterns. And that's exhausting. Why do I have to spend that extra time to figure out, through different channels that are just all over the place about where I could possibly experience racism cross-referenced with migration patterns of elk? And so it's everywhere. It's all the time. But what I've experienced is a disbelief of my experience. So when I tell my white friends, my white family members about these, it's dismissed. It's not cataloged. It's like, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that, maybe it's what you were wearing, maybe they just knew you were from a city, And so I didn't see a decrease in racism. I see an increase in not believing my experience, which is why we want to quantify this, because Parker and I just laughed really loud at the end of your question because we're like, of course this happens to us. But what's happening now with the advent of the protests after George Floyd's murder was people started listening and people started hearing. Yeah. And the reason we launched that week was because before we were trying to figure out how to get people to believe that this was needed. And now all of a sudden we see these articles from around the country that are like, is a new digital green book necessary? And we're like, yeah, it always has been. The only difference now is people are hearing us and believing us and starting to take the time to educate themselves, do their own research, and listen with more open hearts and open minds. We've been saying this, and other people have been saying all of this stuff for weeks, months, years, decades, centuries. But right now, people are starting to hear it. And that's why we decided to launch right now. It wasn't because we were super ready. It's because people like you are super ready. That's the difference.
I also think that, people want to believe that this is all one-off incidents that, if we just fire the person that did that, then we're all good, right? And that's not the case. And it happens every day. That's why I think it's so important to show how widespread it is. It's almost background noise in my life. I was staying somewhere a couple of weeks ago and was waiting for 20 minutes at the check-in desk at this establishment to check my family in. And there were two people chatting. I thought it was another customer. It was not. It was two employees blatantly ignoring me and my presence. And finally, I had to speak up, and they're kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, I can help you. There are these incidences where people are like, whether or not they believe something is racially motivated or not, there's unconscious bias out there that everyone is dealing with, and they are not tackling those issues. And just like we've got sustainable seafood guides and, all of these other guides to help people choose where to spend their money wisely, this is what that will be, not only for people of color, but also for allies, for white allies that are like, I want to support businesses that are inclusive of everyone in my community.
So the two of you have launched a GoFundMe campaign, and your plan, as you've said, is to create this modern-day digital green book. And you're starting off thinking of this as a resource mainly for African-American travelers. But I understand you're also hoping to expand it to help other marginalized communities as well?
From the beginning, we really wanted to make it intersectional as possible. So for people from the LGBTQIA plus community, people with disabilities, people of all abilities, and all of that stuff, like people of different faiths and ethnicities and how they present those, potentially in the face of fear of violence against them. So there really is this intersectionality between all of these communities. So Black is one layer, Black and female is another layer, Black and with a disability is another layer, and Black and trans is another layer. So as you add those layers together, it actually doesn't just add up, it compounds your possible threat of bias being expressed verbally, physically, emotionally, extremely disproportionately. So we want to work and make sure that it does extend to people of any marginalized identity.
Crystal, tell me about the logo you're using for this project.
It's the flying geese quilt pattern. It's got the triangles, and you can see it on our website. Hopefully you could post an image of it as well. But that was a quilt code from the original Underground Railroad, where people would quilt that pattern into an actual quilt and hang it on their fence. And that pattern specifically, there's a lot of different patterns in the quilt code, but this one symbolizes safe food, water, shelter this way. Right? So that's something that we're trying to identify ourselves. So our plan is when businesses or spaces get high enough inclusivity score from the general public, the people who actually go there, we will send them a sticker of our logo with the quilt code. So it's kind of like a modern rebirth of the quilt code. And people can identify visually if they're just walking down the street. They don't even have our website. They're like, oh, I forgot my phone at home. They can see visually like, oh, I could go to that restaurant and I know that it's going to reach a certain level of safety for me. Or at least they'll be trained in how to respond if I have an issue. They'll be open and hear me at the very least. Like they've done their work to get to that level if I do experience some bias there. I see even like teachers putting this sticker on their classroom doors, just to tell students, I'm a safe person you can come to with anything that you need to talk about.
You've raised over $30,000 so far. What sorts of feedback have you heard from people about this idea?
People are so excited. They are super, super excited about this. And people see the wide range of uses from like, I'm planning a wedding and I want to make sure that, if I'm planning a wedding for people who are gay or queer, that they can get their cake made, that the wedding venue is going to be friendly. Can you imagine going to a place that's like, oh, yes, we're accepting of Black people, but we're not going to make your cake because you're gay. We have to have it at all levels, and people are really, really excited about it. Crystal, what are you hearing?
Through the roof. And the thing that's most amazing to me is the people I did not expect to be donating. So I would say the vast, vast majority of our donors are white, cis allies. People talk about putting their money where their mouth is, and they are absolutely doing that. There's people who I consider to be like on the fence about these issues, and they're donating like so much. There's so many people who've actually donated twice. And that is just mind-blowing to me. And then the amount of emails we get, we are talking about somebody just to manage our email inbox because we are just getting flooded with offers for volunteers. Like, it is amazing and it is so inspiring, especially because we actually had to wait for this time to come. We were so worried that this reaction wouldn't happen, and people wouldn't hear us and believe us and support us. I mean, it's so uplifting, and it makes me feel so good. And we got some hate mail pretty early on, and the people that supported us through that, like, it was amazing. It's amazing.
And we're still pushing. Our next goal is 100,000, because as we figure out the features of the website and all the things that it's going to take to bring it together, we're realizing that we need a higher amount of money. But we're excited about it because we're using that money to pay Black and Indigenous people of color to help create it. And so we have original, authentic voices, people who have this experience and that are also very excited to see this come to life and to be able to be in a position to support them and to use their creativity to create something that I really feel like is going to be world changing has been amazing.
That's Parker McMullen Bushman. She and her friend Crystal Egley are the creators of the Digital Green Book Project. If you'd like to find out more or support their efforts, you could visit their website at inclusivejourneys.com, and I'll also link to that and their GoFundMe page from my website at farfromhomepodcast.org, as well as in the podcast show notes. Remember, you could follow Far From Home on Instagram or Facebook, and you could tweet me at Scott Gurian. I haven't mentioned it in a while, but I've also got an email newsletter you could sign up for on my website. And if you've got a story idea of your own you want to tell me about, or you just want to let me know what you thought of what you heard, you could email me at info@farfromhomepodcast.org. Shout out, as always, to the Public Radio Exchange for podcast hosting and technical support. My logo comes from Polemic, which designs award-winning experiences all over the world at the intersection of culture, commerce, and community. Find out how they could help your business at polemicdesign.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.